Welcome back to part two of our introduction to Alexandra Kollontai. You remember that we're looking at her background, and really what we're looking at now is her political activity prior to 1917. So we've already learned a little bit about her background and her education. Now we're really getting into the time where she becomes quite a political activist. So after witnessing Bloody Sunday in 1905, she becomes more and more involved in some of the key discussions of the Bolshevik Party. And in 1906, she decides that the Bolsheviks are a little bit, she doesn't agree with their position on using the revolution automatically to take over the place of the Duma. She's not convinced that the Bolsheviks understand what they're doing at that stage, and so she makes the switch over to the Mensheviks. We'll see these switches a few times from Kollontai, who is, still developing her own thoughts as well. During this time, however, she continues to work behind the scenes, and particularly in organising women workers. And she is organising them to educate them more about their rights, to actually get them to unite together and protest against their employers. And also, she is working against what can be referred to as male chauvinism in the actual socialist parties themselves. These political parties are mostly run by men and have quite traditional attitudes about the roles of men and women. And Kollontai is really developing these key ideas that a true socialist revolution can only come about if both men and women take place in these revolutions. If there is equality between men and women, that's the only time that a true classless society can be created. And these are the ideas that she is working with and developing behind the scenes. And so she is involved in politically agitating to create strikes and protests. Now remember, this is Tsarist Russia, and the Okhrana are certainly onto her. And she has to be very careful while she is in Russia. Eventually, however, she is forced to leave Russia in 1908 and effectively live the life of an exile, just as we know many other socialists had to do at this time. So from 1908 through to 1907, she was living and travelling through a number of different places, including Germany, England, Denmark, Sweden, Belgium, Italy, Switzerland. And during this time, she's not just living a wealthy life, she's actually, just as the other socialists are doing, she's engaged in socialist discussion. She was very active, for example, in the German Social Democratic Party, the socialists within Germany. And so she's there, she's meeting the other key socialists of the day, arguing with them, debating with them, being exposed to their ideas. And during all of this time, she continues to write for Pravda, which is the newsletter publication of the socialist parties in Russia, particularly on women's issues, but on other things as well. We've got to make sure that we don't think of Kollontai as just a one-issue personality. She is very involved and interested in all of the issues that are, being discussed by the socialists at the time. While she's in Germany in particular, she meets women like Clara Zetkin and Rosa Luxemburg, who are the leading female socialists of their time. So we need to understand that Kollontai is really mixing it with the key people, the key socialists that are around in Europe during the time. Now, her son, Misha, that's not a picture of Misha, that's a picture of someone else. As I said, she had a continuing relationship with her son, and he came and joined her in Germany in 1913. He was not a revolutionary himself. In fact, he was quite a plain person, a bit more like his dad. But he did love his mother, and from time to time spent quite a lot of time with her. From 1913 to 1914, Kollontai moves into Sweden, and she is based in Sweden for a time. While she's there, she develops a personal loving relationship with a man called Alexander Shlapnikov. And that's a picture here of Shlapnikov here. Now, Shlapnikov is a Bolshevik, and it shows you how closely the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks worked together while they were overseas. A lot of collaboration in order to develop socialist publications, smuggle them in and out of Russia. So one of the things that they were doing in Sweden was not only developing socialist contacts within that country, but also going through Sweden was a very important way to smuggle socialist literature in and out of Russia, because they go up through Sweden and then across through Finland into the main part of Russia itself. From 1915 to 1917, Kollontai, together with Shlapnikov, moved and had their base in Norway instead. Still an important, place where socialist ideas were being developed, and they could help to smuggle that literature in and out of Russia again. This is important because we're going to see Kollontai come back to Sweden and Norway later on. During this time, 1915 to 1917, Kollontai is really developing these key woman question type publications. And she puts out a couple of really key publications which are going to influence a lot of what the Bolsheviks do when they do come into power. So this Working Woman and Mother, and a second publication, Society and Motherhood. This is where she's really developing these key ideas of the role of women in the new socialist society. And we'll certainly talk more about her writings and her ideas as we go on. Now, one of the things that we need to understand is the relationship between Lenin and Kollontai. Now, it's not a personal sexual relationship. It's more a professional relationship. And it was developed based on mutual respect for each other's writing. Now, Lenin is introduced to Kollontai through Shlapnikov, Kollontai's lover while she's living in Sweden and Norway. And because remember, Shlapnikov is a Bolshevik. And Shlapnikov, writes letters to Lenin about this woman Kollontai and the quality of her writing. And certainly Lenin and Kollontai start writing to each other. That's what you did in those days instead of, no Skyping or anything. So you actually wrote letters. And they had developed a very, robust correspondence with each other, talking to each other about their ideas, critiquing each other's ideas. Kollontai and Shlapnikov, of course, were helping to smuggle Lenin's writings into Russia in their positions there in Sweden and Norway. Kollontai is particularly impressed with Lenin's pamphlet, which he writes in 1914-1915 about the war, because they are both very much against the outbreak of war, calling it a capitalist war and something that Russia should not be involved in. In return, Lenin likes Kollontai's writing style. He wants her to write for Bolshevik publications. And by 1915, she has officially made the switch back to being a Bolshevik. And from this point onwards, there is a very close relationship of mutual respect between Kollontai and Lenin, and very much a sharing of ideas. As I said before, we've got to consider Kollontai as an international social democrat. While she was in exile, it's not like she did nothing. She was mixing with the key female socialists of the time. She was very much involved in running international socialist conferences, particularly those that were aimed at women, and getting women more involved in these socialist conferences. So she's mixing with people from all over the world. In 1915, she wrote a pamphlet called Who Needs the War, based on Lenin's ideas, in terms of keeping the working class out of the war. And this is a very influential pamphlet around the world. And she is actually invited to go on a speaking tour to a number of different places, including 18 weeks in the USA, where socialism was, remember the USA was not a part of the war in 1915. And the socialists were very keen to try to keep America out of the war. And Kollontai went, and you can see here an ad for her. So she's considered to be of Berlin, That's where she was based at the time, although she was actually based in Norway by that stage. But she's described here as a distinguished lecturer of international reputation. Now, Kollontai could speak German and Russian and English and French, and during her speaking tour, she spoke at more than 200 different events and she spoke in 4 different languages. So she is a highly respected international socialist. This is something that we need to remember. So we're going to focus later on looking particularly at Kollontai's writings about women and the role of women in a socialist revolution. But that's not all that she was involved in, and we need to just, consider that she is a broader socialist than that. Some of the ideas that she was interested in include Finland and the right of Finland to independence. We talked already about her background connection with Finland, and she spent quite a bit of time there in her childhood. And her idea of Finland's independence was because what she saw was the average Finnish farmer being, controlled by Imperial Russia. So this was a kind of class warfare in order to give Finland its independence. Certainly, we know that she's written a lot about Russia's involvement in the war, and she was anti-war. She had ideas about whether or not socialists should participate in the Duma, in the Russian parliament or not, or whether they should have a completely separate revolution and do away with the Duma completely. And as we know, as we move into 1917, this is a key difference between the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks about how the revolution should take place. And of course, that last dot point there, whether or not socialists should lead an armed militant revolution. So all of these ideas she wrote about, she discussed with other socialists. So she's becoming known for her ability to write, to stand up at conferences and debate. She was a good speaker, but certainly her writing is probably one of her key features. But by 1917, she has been on the international socialist circuit. She is a known Russian socialist in exile, and she has developed a very close relationship with Lenin in terms of professional respect for each other's ideas. So that leaves us here to now think about the next stage, her rise to prominence, and what she does during 1917.